The lecture hall fell silent as Rachel Mitchell wrapped up her presentation on criminal psychology. Her students began packing their bags, the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations filling the air. But something felt off. She could feel his eyes on her, the new student who had transferred in 2 weeks ago. James Crawford. There was something unsettling about the way he watched her, his gaze carrying a weight that made her skin crawl. "Professor Mitchell." His voice cut through the noise as other students filed out. "I have a question about witness psychology, specifically regarding cases from 2015. Rachel's hand froze over her laptop. 2015, the year everything changed. "I'm particularly interested in cases where witnesses chose silence over testimony," he continued, his dark eyes boring into hers. "What drives someone to protect a criminal, even when they know the truth?" Her throat tightened. That's a complex topic, Mr. Crawford. Perhaps we could discuss it during office hours." She tried to keep her voice steady, professional. "Of course." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I find it fascinating how guilt can eat away at someone over the years. Don't you agree?" Rachel gathered her materials quickly, her hands trembling slightly. As she walked to her office, fragments of memories she'd fought to suppress began surfacing. The warehouse. The gunshots. The silence she'd maintained when the police questioned her. The face of the man who'd threatened her family if she spoke up. In her office, she pulled up the student directory. James Crawford's file was sparse, basic information, a transfer from another state. But something about his enrollment felt wrong. She'd been teaching at Riverside College for 8 years, building a reputation as a respected professor of criminal psychology. Now this student shows up, asking questions that cut too close to the bone. Her phone buzzed, a text from Michael, her closest friend and fellow professor. "Drinks tonight? You look like you need to talk." She did need to talk. The weight of her secret had become unbearable. For years, she'd rationalized her silence about that night. The man had threatened her family. She'd been young, terrified. But her testimony could have put him away sooner, before he hurt others. That evening at O'Malley's, their usual spot, Michael listened as she danced around the subject, unable to fully confide even in him. "There's something about this new student," she said, nursing her whiskey. "He knows things, Mike. Things he shouldn't know. Have you looked into his background? His records are clean. Too clean, almost." She pulled out her phone, showing Michael the sparse student file. "It's like he appeared out of nowhere. Want me to make some calls? I still have contacts in the registrar's office." Rachel nodded, grateful for his help. But as they parted ways, she couldn't shake the feeling that James Crawford's appearance in her life wasn't random. He'd mentioned 2015 specifically. He'd talked about witnesses and guilt. Each question had felt like a carefully aimed arrow. Back home, she found herself pulling out the old newspaper clippings she'd kept hidden in a locked drawer. The headlines screamed about the arrest of Marcus Stone, convicted of multiple armed robberies and assault. But the articles never mentioned her, the witness who'd seen everything and said nothing. Her phone pinged with an email notification. Subject line: "The truth about that night." Sender: anonymous. Rachel's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single photo, grainy security camera footage from outside the warehouse, dated 2015. In it, a younger version of herself stood frozen in the shadows, watching as a man fled the scene. The message below read, "Silence has a price, Professor Mitchell. And it's time to pay." Rachel stared at her laptop screen until her eyes burned, the security camera image searing itself into her memory. She'd spent years convincing herself that night had been a dream, that her silence had been the only choice. Now the past was reaching through time to strangle her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to reply to the anonymous email. Instead, she slammed the laptop shut and paced her living room, mind racing. The timing couldn't be coincidental. James Crawford appears in her class, and suddenly someone's threatening to expose her secret. The next morning, she arrived at campus early, determined to find answers. The registrar's office was quiet, just a few administrative staff preparing for the day. Linda, the head registrar who'd worked there for decades, greeted her warmly. "Rachel. What brings you here so early?" "I need information about a transfer student, James Crawford." Rachel tried to keep her voice casual. "There seems to be some inconsistency in his paperwork." Linda's friendly smile faltered slightly. "That's strange. Let me check." Her fingers flew over the keyboard. "Ha! His transfer papers were processed through the satellite campus in Oakland. But..." She squinted at the screen. "The authorization signature is missing. How did this get approved?" Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket, another email from the anonymous sender. "Digging won't help. Some secrets should stay buried. Like the truth about Marcus Stone." Her hands trembling, Rachel excused herself and hurried to the bathroom. Memories flooded back, the warehouse door creaking open, voices arguing inside. She'd gone there following a lead for her doctoral thesis on criminal psychology. Instead, she'd witnessed Marcus Stone and his partner arguing over stolen money. Then the gunshots. The partner's body hitting the floor. Stone's eyes meeting hers through the gap in the door. "Tell anyone, and your family dies next," he'd growled, pressing a gun to her temple. She'd nodded, tears streaming down her face. She'd kept that promise, even when the police questioned everyone in the area. Even when she heard about Stone's other victims in the months that followed. The bathroom door creaked open. Rachel froze, her reflection pale in the mirror. "Rough morning, Professor Mitchell." James Crawford stood in the doorway, his presence making the small space feel airless. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "This is the women's restroom," Rachel managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mistake." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Though mistakes seem to be a theme in your life, don't they? Especially that night at the warehouse." The world tilted. She gripped the sink for support. "Who are you?" "You already know. You just don't want to admit it." He took a step closer. "My father talked about you, you know. In prison. He wondered why you never came forward, even after he was arrested for other crimes. Was it cowardice? Or something else?" The pieces clicked into place. James Crawford wasn't just a student, he was Marcus Stone's son. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "I'm not here to hurt you," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "I just want the truth. About that night. About why you let my father continue hurting people when you could have stopped him." Rachel's phone buzzed again, a text from Michael, "Found something about Crawford. Need to talk now." "Get out," Rachel whispered, her voice finding strength. "Get out before I call campus security." James held up his hands in mock surrender. "No need for threats. We'll have plenty of time to discuss everything. After all, I'm enrolled in your class for the whole semester." He backed away, that cold smile still playing on his lips. "Oh, and Professor. You might want to check tomorrow's newspaper. I hear there's going to be an interesting story about a witness who chose silence over justice." After he left, Rachel slid to the floor, her legs unable to support her. The weight of her past choices crashed over her like a wave. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed a number she'd sworn she'd never use, the card given to her by Detective Sarah Connor after Stone's arrest. "Detective Connor. This is Rachel Mitchell. We need to talk. It's about Marcus Stone's son." The detective's response chilled her to the bone. "Rachel. Thank God you called. Stone escaped from prison 3 days ago. We've been trying to reach you." Detective Connor's words echoed in Rachel's mind as she sat in her darkened office, blinds drawn. Marcus Stone was free. The man who had haunted her nightmares for years was out there somewhere, while his son played psychological games with her in broad daylight. A knock at the door made her jump. "Rachel?" "It's Mike." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and opened the door to let him in. "You look terrible," he said, closing the door behind him. "What's going on? And why are there two plainclothes officers watching your building?" Rachel sank into her chair. "What did you find out about Crawford?" Michael pulled out his tablet. "His records are fake. The Oakland campus has no record of him ever attending. But here's where it gets interesting." He pulled up a news article from 3 years ago. James Crawford died in a car accident in 2022. The real one, I mean. Someone stole his identity. "He's Stone's son," Rachel said quietly. "He told me himself." Michael's face paled. "Marcus Stone? The serial robber?" He ran a hand through his graying hair. "Rachel, what aren't you telling me?" The weight of a decade's silence pressed down on her. She looked at her oldest friend, the man who'd helped her build a new life after that night, and finally let the truth spill out. She told him everything: the warehouse, the murder she witnessed, Stone's threats, her years of silence. "Jesus, Rachel." Michael slumped in his chair. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I couldn't tell anyone. He threatened my family, Mike. My sister was pregnant at the time. I couldn't." Her voice broke. "But people got hurt because I stayed quiet. 3 more robberies. 2 people dead. If I had spoken up." "You can't blame yourself for what Stone did," Michael said firmly. "You were protecting your family." Her computer pinged, another email. This one contained a video file. With trembling fingers, Rachel clicked play. The footage was grainy, security camera quality, but she recognized herself walking into the warehouse that night. The timestamp matched her memories perfectly. "Where did Crawford get this?" Michael asked, leaning in to watch. "I don't know. The police said all the security footage was corrupted." She paused the video. "Mike, Stone escaped prison 3 days ago. The detective I spoke to thinks he might be coming for me." Michael's face hardened. "You need to leave town. Stay with your sister in Vancouver." "I can't run." Rachel stood up, pacing the small office. "I ran from the truth once before. Look where that got me." She picked up a framed photo from her desk, herself with her students at last year's graduation. "I built a life here. I help people understand the psychology of crime, of victims and perpetrators. Maybe this is my chance to make things right. Or it could get you killed." Michael grabbed her shoulders. "Think about this. Stone is a violent criminal. His son is clearly unstable. This isn't some academic exercise in criminal psychology." Rachel's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number: "Meet me at the warehouse tonight. Time to face the past. Come alone, or the video goes public. Your choice, Professor." "I need to end this," Rachel said, showing Michael the text. "But I need your help. Remember that research we did on crime scene investigation last semester?" Michael's eyes widened. "The paper on digital forensics?" "Rachel, what are you thinking?" She pulled out her laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Crawford's been sending emails, texts. Everything leaves a digital footprint. Help me trace them." For the next hours, they dug through data, following electronic breadcrumbs. Rachel's criminal psychology background merged with Michael's technical expertise. Finally, a pattern emerged. "The emails," Michael said excitedly. "They're all being sent through a server at the public library. 3 blocks from the warehouse." Rachel checked the time, 6:45 p.m. The meeting was set for 8 o'clock. "I need to make some calls." There's a detective who needs to hear this. You're not really going to meet them, are you? Rachel looked at the frozen video frame on her screen, her younger self, walking innocently into a nightmare. Yes, I am. But this time, I'm not going in blind. She pulled out her phone to call Detective Connor, then hesitated. Mike, there's something else you should know. Something I found in Stone's case files. What? The partner he killed that night? The one whose murder I witnessed. She took a deep breath. It was Crawford's uncle. Stone killed his own brother-in-law over stolen money. His son isn't just here for revenge against me. He's looking for answers about his family too. Michael's phone suddenly chimed with a news alert. The headline made their blood run cold. Breaking news, escaped convict Marcus Stone spotted near Riverside College campus. The old warehouse loomed against the darkening sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down at Rachel. She checked her phone, 7:55 p.m. Detective Connor's words rang in her ears, "We'll have plainclothes officers in position, but you need to get him talking. Get him to admit everything." The hidden microphone under her jacket felt like it was burning against her skin. She took a deep breath and pushed open the rusted door, the same door she'd opened 10 years ago. The interior was darker than she remembered, filled with shadows and the musty smell of abandonment. "Right on time, Professor." James Crawford's voice echoed from the darkness. "Just like last time." "Where are you?" Rachel's voice was steadier than she felt. "Upstairs." "Where it happened." A flashlight beam cut through the gloom. "Come on up. Let's talk about the night you watched my father become a murderer." Rachel climbed the metal stairs slowly, each step ringing with a hollow clang. The second floor was one large open space, moonlight filtering through broken windows. Crawford stood by the far wall, his figure silhouetted against the city lights beyond. "Your father killed your uncle here," Rachel said, watching his reaction. "Did he tell you that part?" Crawford's laugh was bitter. "Oh, he told me everything. How Uncle Dave tried to cheat him out of his share. How they fought. How you watched it all happen and then disappeared like a ghost." He stepped closer, his features harsh in the dim light. "But he never told me why you stayed silent. That's what I need to know." "He threatened my family," Rachel said, her voice tight with old fear. "My pregnant sister, my parents." "And what about my family?" Crawford's voice cracked. "My mother died thinking my father was just a thief. She never knew he murdered her brother. I grew up visiting him in prison, believing he was innocent, that the system had failed him. All because you couldn't speak up." A floorboard creaked behind Rachel. She spun around, her heart stopping as a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows. "Hello, Rachel." Marcus Stone's prison-pale face seemed to glow in the darkness. "Miss me?" Rachel backed away, her mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. Stone was supposed to be across town, according to police intelligence. How? How did I know you'd be here?" Stone smiled, pulling out a gun. "My son's been very helpful. Though he doesn't know everything yet, do you, James?" Crawford frowned. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "Tell him, Rachel," Stone said, leveling the gun at her. "Tell him why you really came to the warehouse that night. Tell him about the money." Rachel's throat went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No." Stone reached into his jacket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "Maybe this will refresh your memory. Found it in your Uncle Dave's things, James. Seems Professor Mitchell here wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was Dave's insurance policy." Crawford snatched the envelope, pulling out old photographs and documents. His face went pale as he read. "This is, you were working with him?" "With my uncle?" "No," Rachel said quickly. "It wasn't like that. I was doing research for my dissertation on organized crime. Your uncle contacted me, said he had information about a series of robberies. I didn't know he was involved. I thought he was an informant. But you figured it out, didn't you? Stone pressed. You knew Dave was planning to turn me in, use you as his witness. That's why you were really here that night. Crawford looked up from the documents, his face twisted with confusion and rage. All these years, you weren't just a witness. You were part of it. No. Rachel's voice echoed through the warehouse. I came here because your uncle said he had proof of corruption in the police department. He never told me it involved his own brother-in-law. When I realized what was really happening, it was too late. A police siren wailed in the distance. Stone's head snapped up. You brought them here. It's over, Stone, Rachel said, finding her courage. The police know everything. About the murder, about the corruption, about how you threatened me to stay quiet. They're on their way. Stone's laugh was cold. You think that matters? I've got nothing left to lose. But you, Professor. He raised the gun. You've got a lot to answer for. Dad, no. Crawford stepped between them. This isn't the way. Get out of the way, son. She's been lying to everyone for years. Playing the victim while she was in on it the whole time. That's not true, Rachel said, her voice growing stronger. And I can prove it. She pulled out her phone, displaying an email. This is from your brother-in-law, sent the morning before he died. He was working with internal affairs. They were building a case against corrupt officers who were helping you, Stone. That's what he wanted to tell me. But you got to him first. Crawford read the email, his hands shaking. Uncle Dave was trying to stop you. All this time. The sirens were getting closer. Stone's face twisted with rage. Enough talking. He shoved his son aside and aimed at Rachel. Time to finish what I started 10 years ago. The gun roared in the enclosed space. Rachel felt herself falling. But the bullet never came. Instead, she heard a grunt of pain and saw Crawford tackling his father, the gun skittering across the floor. In the chaos that followed, Rachel scrambled for cover as father and son grappled in the darkness. Suddenly, the warehouse blazed with light as police spotlights flooded through the windows. Detective Connor's voice boomed through a megaphone, Marcus Stone. James Crawford. The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands up. But Stone had one last card to play, a truth that would change everything Rachel thought she knew about that fatal night. Stone's laughter echoed through the warehouse, a hollow sound that made Rachel's skin crawl. You want the truth, son. Your precious uncle wasn't working with internal affairs. He was working with the Mexican cartel. That money wasn't from our robberies, it was drug money. And your professor here knew all about it. Rachel's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, Dave's nervous behavior that night, the massive amount of cash she'd glimpsed, the Spanish voices she'd heard on the phone call before the shooting started. You're lying, Crawford said, but doubt crept into his voice. Check the envelope again, Stone sneered. Look at the bank statements. Those transfers weren't going to internal affairs. Crawford pulled out the papers with trembling hands, scanning the numbers. His face went ash white. These accounts, they're registered in Mexico City. Your uncle was playing both sides, Stone continued, keeping his distance from the windows where police spotlights swept past. He was helping the cartel launder money through our legitimate businesses. When I found out, I confronted him. That's when he brought her into it. He jerked his head toward Rachel. No, Rachel protested. Dave told me he had evidence of police corruption. That's all I knew. Then explain this. Stone pulled out a final document from his jacket. Your signature, Professor. On cartel transfer documents. Dave used your credentials, your reputation as a criminal psychology researcher, to make the transfers look legitimate. Rachel's blood ran cold as she recognized the paperwork. Those signatures are forged. Dave asked me to sign blank research grant applications for his security company. He said they were supporting my dissertation research. And you never thought to check what those documents really were? Stone's voice dripped with mockery. Some criminal psychology expert you are. The police spotlight swept through the window again, illuminating the tense scene. Crawford stood between them, the documents scattered at his feet, his world unraveling with each revelation. The cartel figured out they were being cheated, Stone continued. They sent hitmen after Dave. That's why I had to act first. I killed him to protect our family, James. To protect you and your mother. Protect us. Crawford's voice cracked. Mom died thinking you were just a thief. She defended you until her last breath, and now you're saying you were involved with drug cartels? Everything I did was for our family. Stone roared. Dave was going to get us all killed. And this one, he pointed at Rachel, was going to help him do it. That's why she stayed quiet all these years. She knew she was guilty too. Rachel's mind was spinning, but years of studying criminal psychology helped her see through Stone's manipulation. No, she said firmly. You're twisting everything. I've seen your type before, always justifying your crimes, making yourself the hero of your own story. She turned to Crawford. Your father isn't protecting anyone. He killed Dave because Dave threatened to expose him. Yes, I signed those documents without checking them properly. That was my mistake, and I've paid for it with years of guilt. But your father is the one who pulled the trigger. He's the one who chose violence over truth. Shut up. Stone lunged for the gun on the floor, but Crawford was faster. He scooped up the weapon and backed away, pointing it at his father. James, Stone's voice turned pleading. Son, think about what you're doing. I am thinking. Crawford's hands were steady now. For the first time in years, I'm seeing clearly. You used me. You sent me here to terrorize her, to force her to confess. But you never told me about the cartel, about what really happened to Uncle Dave. Detective Connor's voice boomed through the megaphone again. This is your final warning. Come out now. Rachel saw her chance. James, she said softly. Your uncle made mistakes. Terrible ones. But he tried to make it right in the end. That email I showed you? It wasn't going to Internal Affairs, it was going to the DEA. He was going to expose everything, the cartel connections, the money laundering, your father's involvement. That's the real reason your father killed him. Stone's face contorted with rage. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Rachel pulled out her phone again. Michael didn't just trace your emails, James. He found Dave's old cloud storage. Everything was there, his dealings with the cartel, his plan to turn state's evidence, and proof that your father was more than just his partner in robbery. He was the cartel's main contact. Crawford's hand tightened on the gun. All these years, all the prison visits, the letters, the promises that you were innocent. You let me believe Uncle Dave betrayed you. You let me hate him, hate her, when you were the real traitor. SWAT team members were moving into position outside. They were out of time. James, Rachel said urgently. We can end this now. Help me make it right. Stone tensed, ready to make his final move. You want to know the real truth, son? About what happened that night? About why your mother really died? His words hung in the air like poison, promising one last revelation that would change everything. The warehouse filled with the sound of breaking glass as SWAT teams began their breach. In the chaos that followed, father and son faced each other across the darkness, one final truth waiting to be revealed, while Rachel realized that her own journey from witness to participant in this tragedy was far from over. The warehouse erupted in chaos as SWAT teams breached through multiple entry points. But Stone's voice cut through the mayhem, his words freezing everyone in place. "Your mother didn't die of cancer, James. She killed herself when she found out the truth about everything. About me, about Dave, about the cartel. She left a note, but I got to it first. Couldn't let you know your father drove your mother to suicide, could I?" Crawford's hand trembled on the gun. "You're lying. You have to be lying." "Check your phone," Stone said, his voice eerily calm despite the police closing in. "I sent you something while we were talking. The picture of her note. I've carried it with me every day since then." Rachel watched as Crawford pulled out his phone with his free hand, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. She saw the moment his world shattered, the way his features crumpled, the gun wavering in his grasp. "She knew," he whispered. "She found Dave's records. She knew you were working with the cartel. She knew you killed him." His voice rose to a shout. "She died thinking her son would follow in your footsteps." Stone took a step forward. "Everything I did dash. Don't." Crawford's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't you dare say it was for family. You destroyed our family. You destroyed everything." Rachel saw Stone's muscles tense, recognized the look in his eyes, the same look he'd had the night he killed Dave. He was going to rush his son, try to take the gun. Without thinking, she moved. "James, move." She slammed into Crawford, pushing him aside as Stone lunged forward. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Stone staggered, red blooming across his prison jumpsuit. But he kept coming, his hands reaching for Crawford's throat. SWAT team members swarmed in, tackling Stone to the ground. Crawford stood frozen, the gun slipping from his fingers, as his father was handcuffed and dragged away. "He's armed. Officer down." A voice shouted from below. In the confusion, no one had noticed Michael sneaking into the warehouse. He'd followed Rachel, worried about her safety, and had intercepted one of Stone's associates trying to enter through the back, a cartel member coming to tie up loose ends. Hours later, Rachel sat in Detective Connor's office, giving her statement. The truth about everything, Dave's manipulation, Stone's crimes, the cartel connection, was finally coming out. Her testimony, combined with Dave's recovered files and Stone's confession in the warehouse, would put him away for life. "What about James?" she asked. Connor sighed. "He's cooperating. Between the forged documents, the harassment, and the gun charge, he's looking at some time. But given the circumstances and his help in bringing down his father, the DA's willing to be lenient." Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of the past decade finally beginning to lift. "I'd like to help with his case, if I can. He was a victim in this too." "Always the professor," Connor smiled. "Even now, you're trying to understand the psychology behind it all." "Understanding is the first step to healing," Rachel said quietly. "I learned that the hard way." 6 months later, Rachel stood at the front of her lecture hall, looking out at a new semester of students. Her textbook, The Psychology of Silence, Understanding Witness Trauma and Recovery, lay open on the podium. The case that had nearly destroyed her life had become a teaching tool, helping others understand the complex dynamics of crime, family, and redemption. A letter sat in her bag, from James Crawford, now in a minimum security facility where he was getting counseling and working on his degree. "You were right," he'd written. "The truth hurts, but silence kills. I'm learning to live with both." As she began her lecture on witness psychology, Rachel thought about the warehouse, about Stone, about Dave's betrayal and James's pain. She thought about her own journey from terrified witness to unwitting accomplice to someone who finally found the strength to speak up. "Today, we're going to talk about choices," she told her students. "About the moments that define us, and the courage it takes to face them. But most importantly, we're going to talk about redemption, and how it's never too late to choose truth over silence. Outside her office window, the autumn leaves were turning, nature's reminder that change was constant, inevitable, and sometimes beautiful. On her desk, next to her new book, sat a small plaque, a gift from Michael. It read simply, "Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and speaking up anyway." Rachel touched the plaque, thinking about all the witnesses, all the silent observers of crime who carried their secrets like stones. Her voice would help them find their own courage. That would be her real redemption. As she turned back to her class, she saw a new light in her students' eyes, understanding, empathy, and the dawning realization that every choice, every silence, every word spoken or withheld, had the power to change lives. Including their own.